The apartment didn't make sense. That was the first thing I noticed when I walked in. I had seen enough listings to know how this usually worked. If something was cheap, there was always a reason. Bad neighbors, noise, damage, something hidden that only showed itself after you signed. But this place didn't have any of that. It was an older building, sure. Brick exterior, narrow hallway, the kind of place that had probably been there longer than most of the businesses around it. But inside it was clean, not freshly cleaned, just consistently clean. Like nothing had ever really gone wrong in it. The floors weren't scratched, the walls weren't marked. Even the corners, the places people usually ignored, were clear of dust. It felt quiet too. Not just no noise from neighbors. Quiet. Still. Like the building itself didn't make any sound. I remember standing in the middle of the living room for a moment, just listening. Nothing. No footsteps above me. No TV through the walls. Nothing from the hallway. Just silence. "You're here for the unit." I turned around. The landlord was standing in the doorway. I hadn't heard him come back. "Yeah," I said. "This is all of it?" He nodded once. That's it. He didn't move, just stood there watching. I walked through the rest of the apartment. Bedroom, bathroom, kitchen. Everything worked. Lights didn't flicker. Water pressure was fine. No smell. No signs of damage. I checked twice, expecting to find something. There wasn't anything. When I came back into the living room, he was still standing in the same place. "What's wrong with it?" I asked. "Nothing. The price, it's correct." He didn't hesitate when he said it. That should have bothered me more than it did. But I needed the place, and everything about it made it hard to say no. "I'll take it," I said. He nodded again, like he already knew I would. The paperwork was quick, barely anything to read. Standard lease. Nothing unusual, until the end. He didn't hand me the keys right away. "There's one thing," he said. I looked up. "A rule." That was the first time his tone changed. Not threatening, not serious, just deliberate. "What kind of rule?" He looked directly at me. "Once a week," he said. "Leave something outside your door." I waited. "That's it?" I asked. "That's it." "What kind of something?" He gave a small shrug. "Up to you." I almost laughed. "That's weird." He didn't react. "It's part of the agreement," he said. "You don't need to understand it. Just follow it." There was nothing about it in the lease. No clause, no written condition. Just that one sentence. I thought about it for a second, then nodded. "All right." He handed me the keys. And that was it. The first week went by without anything happening. The apartment stayed the same. Quiet. Clean. Easy. That was the best way to describe it. Easy to live in. No distractions. No small problems building up like they usually did. No random noise pulling my attention away. Everything just worked. By the end of the week, I remembered the rule. I had almost forgotten about it. It didn't feel important. Just something I had agreed to because it didn't seem like it mattered. I stood in the hallway that night, holding a bit of cash. It seemed like the simplest option. I placed it on the floor, right in front of my door. For a second, I just stood there, looking at it. Then I went back inside, closed the door, didn't think about it again. The next morning it was gone. No sound during the night, no sign of anyone being there. Just gone. I stood in the hallway for a few seconds, looking down at the spot where I'd left it. The floor looked cleaner than I remembered. Not by much, just enough to notice. The air smelled faintly fresh, like someone had cleaned early in the morning. I looked down the hallway. No one there, no open doors, no movement. I went back inside. The apartment felt different. I noticed it immediately, but I couldn't explain why. The air felt lighter. The space felt clearer. I walked into the kitchen. The counter looked cleaner than I remembered leaving it. The sink, too. I stood there for a second, trying to think back. Had I cleaned it before going to bed? I couldn't remember. The thought passed. That night I lay in bed staring at the ceiling. Usually my mind wouldn't stop. Random thoughts, things I needed to do, things I forgot to do, conversations looping over and over. But this time, there was nothing. No noise, no tension, just quiet. I don't remember falling asleep. When I woke up, I felt rested, completely rested. No heaviness, no leftover fatigue, just clear. I sat up slowly, looking around the room. The same apartment, the same silence. But something about it felt different now. Better. I got out of bed and stood there for a moment. Then I looked toward the front door, toward the hallway outside. And for the first time, the rule didn't feel strange anymore. I didn't question it the second time. A week passed faster than it should have. I didn't think about the rule much during those days, but I noticed something else instead. How easy everything had become. There was nothing in the apartment that demanded attention. Nothing broke, nothing got dirty, nothing needed fixing. Usually small things pile up. Dishes, dust, random clutter you don't deal with right away. It builds slowly until you have to deal with it. That didn't happen here. I'd leave something out, come back later, and it would already be clean. Not freshly cleaned, just reset. Like it had never been used. The first time I told myself I just hadn't noticed. The second time, I paid attention. At the end of the week, I remembered the rule again. This time, it didn't feel like an afterthought. It felt expected. I took out cash, more than the first time, and stepped into the hallway. It was the same as before. Quiet. Empty. That faint, clean smell still in the air, like something had passed through recently without being seen. I placed the money down in front of my door. For a moment, I stayed there again. Listening. Nothing. I went back inside. The next morning, it was gone. That part didn't surprise me anymore. What did surprise me was everything else. The hallway looked sharper. That was the only way I could describe it. The light felt clearer. The walls looked cleaner than they had the day before. Even the floor. There was no trace of anything. No dust, no marks, nothing that suggested anyone had even walked through it. I crouched slightly, running my fingers along the floor where I'd left the money. Smooth, completely clean. I stood up and looked down the hallway again. Still empty. Inside the apartment, the changes were easier to notice now that I was looking for them. The kitchen counter was spotless. I knew for a fact I hadn't cleaned it before going to bed. The sink, same thing. Even the small things were different. A loose handle on one of the cabinets that had been slightly off when I moved in, it sat perfectly aligned now. I opened and closed it a few times. No resistance, no sound. I stepped back, trying to remember if it had always been like that. I couldn't. That day felt easier. That was the part I couldn't ignore. Work didn't drag. Normally, I had to push myself through tasks, force my focus back when it drifted. It wasn't extreme, just constant. A low-level effort that never really stopped. But that day, I didn't have to do that. I sat down, started working, and just stayed there. No distraction, no restlessness. Time moved differently, faster, cleaner. That night, I paid attention. I lay in bed, waiting. Usually, that's when everything catches up to me. Thoughts I ignored during the day come back. Things I need to fix, things I forgot, things I don't want to think about. But there was nothing. No buildup, no tension, just quiet. I fell asleep almost immediately. The next week, I didn't wait until the last moment. I thought about it during the day, how much I should leave. That was new. I stood in my apartment holding the money, thinking about it longer than I expected. Then I went into the hallway and placed it down again. A little more than before. The effect was stronger. Not dramatically. Just enough that I could feel the difference. The apartment wasn't just clean. It felt maintained. like everything inside it was being held in place. Nothing shifted, nothing degraded, nothing even felt slightly off. I walked through each room slowly, paying attention to details. The bathroom tiles looked newer. The mirror didn't fog at all after a shower. The air felt lighter, clearer. That was when I decided to test it. The next week I left less, not much less. Just enough to see if it changed anything. The difference was immediate. The hallway still looked clean, but not perfect. There was a faint mark near the wall I hadn't seen before. Inside the apartment, everything was still fine, but something felt heavier. Not physically, just enough that I noticed it. My thoughts weren't as sharp. My focus slipped once or twice during the day. Sleep still came, but not as fast. I lay there a little longer than before, thinking. That was enough. The next week, I went back to leaving more. The change hit almost immediately again. The apartment returned to that same state. Clean, still, balanced. The air felt right again. My thoughts settled. Everything lined up the way it had before. After that, I stopped pretending it was nothing. I stood in the hallway one morning, looking at the empty spot where the money had been, thinking it through. The pattern was clear. More gave me more. Less gave me less. It wasn't random. It wasn't coincidence. It responded. Exactly. That night I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, not waiting anymore, just knowing. Whatever this was, it worked. It stopped feeling optional. That was the difference. The first few weeks I told myself it was just something I was doing, a routine, a strange habit tied to a strange place. By the time the next week came around, it wasn't a habit anymore. It was expectation. Still, there was a part of me that wanted to know what would happen if I didn't. Not out of confidence, out of curiosity. I told myself it was a test, that if it really worked the way I thought it did, skipping once would show me something, so I didn't leave anything. The night felt different immediately, not dramatically, just off. I noticed it when I stepped into the hallway before going to bed. There was no smell of cleaning products, no sense of freshness. The air felt heavier, like the building hadn't been touched in a while. I stood there for a moment, looking down at the empty space in front of my door. Then I went back inside. The apartment didn't feel the same either. At first it was small things. The counter wasn't clean. Not dirty exactly, but not reset the way it had been. There were faint marks on it, streaks I hadn't seen in weeks. The sink had spots. The bathroom mirror fogged again when I turned on the hot water. I stood there longer than I needed to, staring at it, watching the condensation build up along the edges. Something about it felt wrong. Not because it was unusual, because it was normal again. That night I lay in bed, waiting. Sleep didn't come, not right away. My mind didn't settle. Thoughts came back, one after another. Small things, random things, things I hadn't thought about in weeks. It didn't feel overwhelming, just constant. I turned onto my side, then onto my back again, checked the time, closed my eyes, opened them again. It took hours before I finally fell asleep. When I woke up, I didn't feel rested. That part hit immediately. My body felt heavier, slower, and there was a tension in my chest I hadn't felt since before I moved in. I sat up in bed and stayed there for a while, trying to shake it off. The hallway was worse. I saw it as soon as I opened the door. The floor had marks, not large ones, just faint streaks, like something had been dragged lightly across it. The walls looked dull. The light felt weaker, and there was a sound, faint. Somewhere down the corridor, a soft, irregular noise, not loud enough to identify. Just there. I stood still, listening. It stopped. Back inside, the apartment had changed more. Things weren't where I remembered leaving them. Not dramatically, just slightly off. A chair angled differently than I'd left it. A glass moved closer to the edge of the counter. The remote wasn't in the same spot. I told myself I had just forgotten, that I hadn't been paying attention, but I had. That was the problem. I had been paying attention. By the afternoon, it was worse. The air felt thick, not dirty, just heavy, like the space itself was holding something. I opened a window. It didn't help. That night I heard it again. From the hallway. A sound. Soft. Dragging. I froze where I was standing. Listening. It moved slowly past my door. Then stopped. Right outside. I didn't move. Didn't breathe. Just stood there, staring at the door. Waiting for something. Nothing happened. After a while, the sound continued, fading down the hallway. I didn't sleep that night. Not really. Every time I closed my eyes, something pulled me back. A thought, a sound, and the feeling that something had shifted and I didn't understand how far it had gone. By morning, I wasn't thinking about testing anything anymore. I stood in the apartment, holding cash in my hand. More than I had left before. I didn't think about the amount. Didn't hesitate. I just opened the door, stepped into the hallway, and placed it down. I stayed there longer this time, watching it, listening. Nothing happened. But the air felt different already. Lighter. Like something had been waiting. The next morning it was gone, and everything was back. Immediately. The hallway. Clean. Perfect. No marks. No sound. The faint smell of cleaning products returned. Inside the apartment, everything was reset. The counter spotless, the mirror clear, the air light again. I stood in the middle of the room, taking it in. Breathing slowly. Letting the tension leave my body. That night I slept instantly. No thoughts, no noise, just silence. I lay there for a while before closing my eyes, staring at the ceiling, thinking about what had happened. Not as a question anymore, as something I understood. I turned my head slightly toward the door, toward the hallway beyond it, and for the first time, I didn't think of it as a rule. Rules can be ignored, broken, tested. This wasn't that. This was something else, something that expected something in return and didn't tolerate being denied. I closed my eyes and accepted it. This wasn't a rule, it was a demand. It didn't happen all at once. At first I thought I was imagining it. The effects were still there. The apartment was still clean. The air still felt light. I still slept without thinking. But something had changed. It wasn't as strong anymore. I noticed it in small ways. The hallway wasn't as sharp as before. Still clean, but not perfect. The smell of cleaning products was fainter. Inside the apartment, everything still worked, but it didn't feel held together the same way. Like whatever had been maintaining it had loosened its grip. I tried increasing the amount. More money. More than I had left before. I stood in the hallway, placed it down, and went back inside. The next morning, it was gone. The effect returned, but not completely. Better, but not like before. That was the first time I understood something had changed. It wasn't about the action anymore. It was about the value. The next week, I left even more. Enough that I actually hesitated before putting it down. I watched it for a moment longer than usual, then went back inside. The result was stronger, noticeably stronger. The apartment returned to that perfect state. The air felt clear again. My thoughts settled immediately. Sleep came without effort, but it didn't last. By the end of the week, it started fading again. Faster this time. I stood in the living room, looking around. Everything still looked clean, but I could feel it slipping. The balance wasn't stable anymore. That was when I stopped thinking about money. I opened a drawer, looked at the things inside. Small things, personal things, stuff I hadn't thought about in a while. I picked up an old watch. It wasn't worth much, but I had kept it for years. I stood there for a while, turning it in my hand. Then I put it down. That night, I placed it outside the door. The next morning, it was gone. And the difference was immediate. Stronger than anything I had felt with money. The hallway was perfect again. The apartment, completely reset. The air felt clearer than it had ever been. I stood there, breathing slowly, understanding. The next week I did it again. Not money, something else. A jacket I had owned for years. Didn't wear it anymore. but I remembered where I got it, when, why I kept it. I placed it outside. The effect was stronger again. That was when it became obvious. It wasn't about the object. It was about what it meant. I started choosing differently, not based on value, based on attachment. An old box of photos. I hesitated with that one. Sat with it for a long time before deciding. Flipped through them. Faces, places, moments I hadn't thought about in years. I tried to remember when some of them were taken. Some I couldn't place immediately. That bothered me more than it should have. I closed the box, took it to the door, placed it outside. The next morning it was gone, and the apartment felt perfect, more than before. Not just clean, complete. I walked through each room slowly. Everything was exactly where it should be. No flaws, no inconsistencies, no resistance. But something else was different. Later that day, I tried to think about one of the photos, a specific one. I knew it had been important. I knew I had looked at it for a while before giving it away. But when I tried to picture it, nothing came. I sat down, frowning slightly, trying again. The place, the people, anything. There was nothing there, just a blank space where something should have been. I told myself it didn't matter, that I probably just forgot, that it wasn't important. The next week, I chose something else, a small box from the back of a closet. Things I hadn't opened in a long time. I didn't go through it this time. I didn't want to hesitate again. I placed it outside. The effect was immediate, stronger. The apartment felt stabilized, like whatever had been slipping was now locked in place again. That night, I slept deeper than I ever had. The next morning, I tried to remember what had been in the box. I stood in the middle of the room, thinking, trying to reconstruct it. I couldn't. It wasn't just the contents. It was the reason I had kept it. That was gone too. I didn't panic. Not yet. I just stood there, breathing slowly, trying to understand what I had traded. The next week came faster. I didn't hesitate anymore. I went straight to the closet, picked something, didn't think about it too long. Each time the effect was the same. Stronger, cleaner, sharper. And each time something else faded. At first it was small things, details, moments. Then it became larger. I stood in the kitchen one morning, holding a cup in my hand, trying to remember where I got it. Nothing. I knew it had meant something. I knew there had been a reason I kept it. But that reason wasn't there anymore. I looked around the apartment. Everything was perfect, exactly as it should be. And I realized something else. The things I was giving away. I wasn't just losing them. I was losing everything attached to them. I stood there for a long time, thinking, trying to decide if it mattered. Then I looked toward the door, toward the hallway. The apartment was perfect. The air was clear. My mind was quiet. And whatever I had lost, I couldn't feel it anymore. That was the part that made it easy. The next week, I went to choose something else. I opened a drawer, looked inside, stopped. There were things in there I knew I should recognize, but I didn't. I picked one up, turned it in my hand, waited for something to come back. Nothing did. I stood there for a moment longer. Then I took it to the door, placed it outside, closed the door. That night I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. The apartment was perfect, completely still, completely clean. I tried to think of someone, a specific person, someone I knew had been important. I couldn't remember their face. I closed my eyes and didn't try again. It stopped lasting. That was the first thing that changed. Not suddenly, not all at once, just shorter. The apartment was still perfect after each offering. Clean, still, balanced, but it didn't hold. By the end of the week, I could feel it slipping again, faster than before. I noticed it in the air first, that same heaviness creeping back in. Not strong, just enough to feel the difference. The hallway lost that sharpness. The smell faded. The silence wasn't complete anymore. There were small sounds again. Distant, unclear. Inside the apartment, things began to shift. Not dramatically, just slightly off. A mark on the counter. A faint streak on the floor. The mirror fogging again. I stood there, staring at it, waiting for it to correct itself. It didn't. I went back to the door, stood in the hallway, looked at the empty space. It wasn't enough anymore. The next time, I chose something more personal. Something I knew mattered. Or at least, I knew it had mattered. I didn't hesitate like before. That part was gone now. The hesitation, the attachment. I placed it outside, closed the door. The effect came back, stronger, cleaner, more complete. But again, it didn't last. By the end of the week, the same pattern, the same decline. I sat in the living room, staring at the walls, trying to understand it. It wasn't just taking things, it was measuring something. I stood up, walked through the apartment slowly. Everything looked right, but I could feel the instability underneath it. I needed more. That was the thought. Clear, simple. I opened drawers, closets, boxes. There wasn't much left that meant anything, not in the way it used to. I picked things up, turned them in my hands, waited for some kind of reaction, some feeling. Most of the time, there was nothing. Whatever had been attached to them was already gone. I dropped them back into place, closed the drawer. That was when I understood something else. It wasn't just about giving something up. It was about losing something, and there wasn't much left to lose. The next week came faster than it should have. The apartment had already started slipping, earlier than before. I stood in the kitchen, hands resting on the counter, breathing slowly. I looked toward the door. There was nothing left I could give. That was the moment everything changed. I went to the bathroom, turned on the light, looked at myself in the mirror. I stood there for a while, not thinking, just looking. Then I reached into the drawer. I didn't hesitate. The first cut was shallow, instinctive, not enough. I watched it for a second, then again, deeper. Pain registered immediately. Sharp, clear. I stayed there watching it. Then I moved, walked to the door, opened it. The hallway felt different, like it was waiting. I stepped forward, left something there. Not an object, closed the door. The reaction was instant. The air shifted. Immediately, the apartment snapped back into place. Not gradually, not slowly. Instantly, clean, perfect, silent, stronger than anything before. I stood in the middle of the room, breathing slowly, feeling it settle. Everything was aligned again. There was no resistance anywhere. My thoughts were completely still. That night, sleep came faster than ever. No delay, no interruption, nothing. The next morning, I stood in front of the mirror again. I looked at myself. There was no hesitation this time, no confusion. I understood it now. It was never about money. It was never about the objects. It was about what it cost me. The more it cost, the more it gave. I stood there for a long time, looking at myself. There wasn't much left to question. I turned away from the mirror, walked back into the apartment. Everything was perfect. And for the first time, I knew exactly what it wanted. I looked toward the door and made a decision. I wasn't going to stop. It didn't happen in one moment. There wasn't a point where I could say this is where it ended. It just kept going. At first, I still noticed the changes. I could still tell when something was gone. A thought that didn't form. A memory I couldn't reach. A name that felt like it should be there but wasn't. I would stop for a second, stand still, try to pull it back. Nothing came. But the difference now was, it didn't matter. There was no frustration, no panic, no sense of loss. Just the awareness that something had been there before, and now it wasn't. Then even that awareness started to fade. The apartment stayed perfect. That part never changed. Every time something slipped, every time the air felt heavier or the silence wasn't complete, I fixed it, without thinking, without hesitation. I didn't count the times anymore. Didn't measure what I gave. Didn't compare it to anything. There was no reference left. At some point, I stopped recognizing the things I was giving up. I would stand in front of a drawer, open it, and look inside. There were objects there. I knew they belonged to me. I knew they had been placed there for a reason. But I didn't know what that reason was. I would pick something up, turn it in my hand, wait. Nothing. No memory attached to it. No feeling. No hesitation. So I would take it to the door, place it outside, close the door, and the apartment would respond. Immediately. Perfect. Again, there were no more weak effects. No more fading. Everything held. Everything stayed. The air was completely still. No movement. No variation. Even sound felt different. There wasn't silence in the normal sense. There was just nothing. No background noise, no distant movement, no small imperfections that usually exist in any space, just absence. I moved through the apartment slowly. Not because I was thinking about it, because there was nothing else to do. I didn't have routines anymore, didn't have habits, didn't have anything that pushed me from one moment to the next. I would stand somewhere, then I would be somewhere else. Time passed, but it didn't feel like it did. There were no markers, no events, no interruptions. Just the same state, repeating. At some point, I stopped trying to remember anything. There was nothing left to remember. I sat down in the living room, looked at the walls. They were clean, perfect, no marks, no variation. I tried to think about something, anything. There was nothing there. No thoughts formed, no questions followed. Even the idea of questioning something didn't exist anymore. I just sat there, not waiting, not thinking, just existing. Eventually, I stood up. There was no reason for it. No decision behind it. I walked through the apartment again. Bedroom, bathroom, kitchen, living room, everything exactly the same, exactly as it should be. There was nothing left to improve, nothing left to give. That was when something else became clear. Not as a realization, not as a thought, just a fact. I didn't need to be there anymore. The apartment didn't need anything from me, and I didn't need anything from it. I walked to the door. My hand rested on the handle for a moment. There was no hesitation. I opened it. The hallway was perfect, clean, still, empty, no sound, no movement. I stepped out, closed the door behind me. I didn't look back. There was nothing to look at. I walked down the hallway, past doors that never opened, past walls that never changed. No one was there. No one saw me leave. I reached the end of the corridor, went down the stairs. Each step felt the same. No variation, no sound beyond the movement itself. I reached the entrance, opened the door. Outside, the air felt different. Not better, not worse, just unfamiliar. I stood there for a moment. There was no thought attached to it, no comparison. Then I started walking. No direction, no destination, just movement. Behind me, the building remained unchanged. A few minutes later, someone approached it. The landlord. He walked up to the entrance like he always had. No hesitation, no pause. Unlocked the door, stepped inside. The building swallowed him the same way it had swallowed everything else. After a short time, he came back out. He was holding a sign. Simple, clean. He placed it carefully near the entrance, adjusted it slightly until it stood straight. For rent. That was all it said. Nothing else. No explanation, no detail. A car slowed down at the curb. 2 people inside, looking. They stopped, got out, stood there for a moment, taking in the building. One of them nodded slightly, said something. The other agreed. They walked toward the entrance, the sign still standing in front. Clear, simple, for rent. They didn't hesitate. The door opened. They stepped inside, and it closed behind them. The building stayed quiet, still, perfect, and whatever was inside was ready again.